All right, with that, we will move to our last presenter of the day, Dr. Colin Mendelsohn. For those of you that were at the Michael Russell Award presentation last night, this biography might be a little bit redundant, but if you weren't, he today will be discussing what are the harms of vaping in young people who have never smoked. Colin has worked as a clinician and academic in smoking cessation and harm reduction for 40 years. He was a conjoint associate professor in the School of Public Health and Community Medicine at the University of New South Wales. He's founding chairman of the Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association, a health promotion charity established to raise awareness of tobacco harm reduction options. Colin is the author of a book, Stop Smoking, Start Vaping. He has no financial or commercial relationship with any electronic cigarette or tobacco company.
Hi everyone. This video isn't as slick as the others you may have seen. I made it at home myself, and that will become obvious when you see it, but I hope it's not too painful. But it's based on a study we did and had published a year ago, and it was produced a year ago, and I'd like to update some of the data after the study, after the video. So if I could, these are my conflicts of interest, the main one being I've never received funding from tobacco or e-cigarette companies. So if we could see the video, we come back and talk. Play the video now.
The media is full of alarming reports about youth vaping. You'd think the world as we know it was about to end. Young people are vaping, but what about those who have never smoked? This is the at-risk group, as they're exposed to potential new harms from vaping. Well, we looked at the evidence to find out about this, and in particular, how frequently are non-smoking youth vaping? Is vaping increasing smoking rates? What are the harms of youth vaping? And how common is nicotine dependence? And this is what we found. Firstly, frequent vaping by non-smoking youth is rare. Most vaping by adolescents who have never smoked is occasional and short-term and is of little public health importance. Recent data isn't available in Australia, but in international surveys, generally less than 2% of young people who have never smoked vape frequently. Frequent vaping is defined as daily, weekly, or 20 days or more in the last month, depending on the survey. This figure from England shows that only 1% of 11 to 15-year-olds in England who have never smoked vape once or more weekly. Frequent vaping is largely confined to smokers and former smokers, and to them, vaping is likely to be beneficial. Secondly, vaping is not a gateway to smoking. There is no good evidence that vaping causes young people to take up regular smoking if they wouldn't have otherwise done so. In fact, the evidence suggests that vaping is diverting young people away from smoking and reducing smoking rates. As youth vaping has increased, the decline in youth smoking has accelerated in many Western countries, as this figure shows for the US. Even if there is a small gateway effect, it's outweighed by the much larger number moving from smoking to vaping. Thirdly, the known health effects of vaping in non-smokers are small. Most teens who vape but have never smoked vape infrequently, so their exposure to toxins is low, and the health effects so far appear to be small. Vaping can cause short-term effects such as throat irritation, cough and nausea, and nicotine dependence, which can cause short-term withdrawal symptoms. But there's no evidence of clinically important respiratory symptoms from vaping or of an increased risk in asthma. Teens who smoke don't have significant differences in adulthood in IQ, educational achievement or cognitive function compared to those who've never smoked. So vaping is likely to do little harm. High doses of nicotine can harm the adolescent brain in rats and mice, but there's no evidence of harm in humans. But there's no doubt that this little fella here shouldn't vape, and we're very certain about that. There may be harms from long-term vaping, and these need to be monitored, but these are likely to be small. Fourthly, nicotine dependence is rare. Vaping can cause nicotine dependence in a small minority of young people who've never smoked, but it hasn't created a new generation addicted to nicotine, as the media and certain politicians like to tell us. One large study in the US found that less than 4% of young people who'd vaped in the past 30 days but never smoked had signs of nicotine dependence. Nicotine dependence is largely concentrated in young people who have previously or currently smoked. Vaping policies in many countries is driven by an obsession with reducing these small and potential harms to youth. But it often discounts the substantial health benefits of vaping to their parents and grandparents. And we need to get that balance right. An overly restrictive regulatory approach to protect young people may reduce the access and appeal of vaping to adult smokers, and is likely to lead to more adult smoking and overall do more harm. Regulations should consider both groups and focus on the overall public health benefit. Please read our article to find out more.
With a couple of slides, which I hope will now appear. Slides, that's pushing the thing, and oh, it's coming? Yes, okay, so, yes. So I wanted to make the point that this paper I published in Filter analysed the risk-benefit analysis of youth vaping. It's a bit controversial to say it, but I think the benefits overall of youth vaping outweigh the risks for young people. I know that's a bit controversial, but when you consider the fact that vaping is diverting even a small number of kids from smoking, that in itself is huge. In smokers who switch to vaping, of course there's a substantial benefit, and we're learning more and more that kids are benefiting from nicotine. Like in the Canadian study, 30% of the kids who vape say they vape to reduce anxiety. And they vape for ADHD, they vape to reduce weight, to improve concentration. There are a whole range of benefits, and we can't ignore those. Not to mention their parents aren't, well, we're talking about the kids vaping, okay, we'll talk about the benefits just to kids. There are some modest harms from nicotine, but really I think quite small. Nicotine dependence, I think, is overrated. I mean, it's not a serious condition. After a couple of weeks, you stop nicotine and you feel back to normal. But it can be a problem for some kids, for sure. This is rather complicated, but just to update some of the data, in Australia, in our recent survey, we found that 15.7% of 12 to 17-year-olds have vaped in the last month. These are current last month figures from a number of countries. Compare that to the United States, it's now 7.7%, 7.6% in the ASH study, 9% in England in the ONS study. 44 countries were checked by the World Health Organization recently. These are all fairly recent studies, but you can see that current vaping rate is much lower. Yes, it's higher in Canada and in New Zealand, but I think overall, even with all the harsh restrictions in Australia, we are ending up with a very high youth. It's having a counterproductive effect. And what's also interesting is that in Australia, smoking rate is rising sharply. As you saw earlier, the smoking rate in the US has dropped dramatically in recent times. In New Zealand, yes, it was high until regulation, and once they regulated, it's dropped 20%. In Canada, it's falling since regulation. In England and Great Britain, it's kind of steady or a little bit going up. But they're all regulated countries. In Australia, without regulation, unfortunately, we're seeing the opposite effect. And the other point I wanted to make was, before this one, on the next one, okay, is that we get terribly distressed about the huge numbers of kids vaping, but in fact what we're finding is that the actual number of youth vapers is only a very small proportion of the total number of vapers. And I think that really is important to take into account, because we're developing policy in Australia for 5.4% of the total vaping population. We're forgetting about what's happening to this population here, their parents and grandparents who are dying from smoking. And I think we need to take that into account when we balance the pros and cons and the approach to vaping. And the same, and this is figures based from Great Britain, I worked out about 8% of total vapers are underage. So we just need to take that into account. We mustn't forget either group, but we need to just weigh the prevalence. And finally, I just wanted to come back to this point about policy being based on the minor issues. Policy is currently emphasising the minor issues for youth. That's what's driving policy. It's very emotional politically, carries a lot of weight, but they're only a very small minority, and the risk for them is quite trivial, and I think it's quite distant, because many of them are going to stop. Half the kids who vape in the UK and in Australia vape once or twice, according to the national survey. So this is not a really terribly at-risk group, but who's at risk is their parents and grandparents. They're given a very low priority in regulation, but they're the vast majority of vapers, and they're the ones who are going to die and get very sick very soon. So I think we need to take that into account. Thank you. So I can take some questions. Thank you. Yeah, Carolyn.
Wait.
Do you remember the question I told you to ask?
Hello, Carolyn Beaumont, also from Australia. I think it'd be really valuable to really have a deep dive into why youth are vaping. I mean, the common reason is that it's just out of curiosity and everyone else is doing it. But certainly things like for undiagnosed ADHD, for example, which is a huge, huge problem. It's, in Australia, as I'm sure in most other countries, it's so hard to be able to access an adolescent psychiatrist to, get a diagnosis and maybe start some sort of stimulant medication. So kids are just really struggling, and it's not surprising that they self-medicate with nicotine. So it'd be great to see figures on that. As we all know, things like childhood, obesity, self-esteem issues, other mental health issues, eating disorders, they're all rampant. So it's not surprising that they might sort of trial nicotine to help with, appetite suppression as well. I think it would be great to really get a picture of the true underlying reasons rather than just saying, they're trying it because of curiosity.
And the other question always is, what would they be doing if vaping wasn't available?
Or probably getting really low grades and dropping out of school and getting up to all sorts of mischief, and
smoking,
trying other things, smoking. Yeah,
thank you. That was exactly what good, thank you. Yes, one down the back there.
Thank you for the presentation. Joe Williams from the United States at Altria. Quick story, then I'll get to my question. About 2 years ago, Portland, Maine in the United States, the city council was considering a flavor ban. And before the members went around and they voted, they all told a little story. They gave their spiel on why they were going to support the ban. First councilwoman gets up and shares her speech. She said that her daughter had started vaping. And when she caught her with a vape, she told her, honey, if you're going to start vaping, I'd rather you smoke a cigarette instead. It's better for you. Clearly, there were some relative risk misperceptions going on there. So going off of that, what impact do you think relative risk, misinformation, and disinformation plays?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. It's discouraging adults who smoke from becoming vapers. It's discouraging dual users from switching to just vaping. Why would you bother? The cigarette is just as bad as the e-cigarette. I think there's a huge job to be done there, and I don't know how we're going to correct that problem, but it's a pervasive problem that's been around as long as I've been practicing medicine. So yes, it's a big problem, and it seems to be getting worse. And I think it's something that's probably being promulgated by the anti-vaping brigade. I think it's something they think can undermine vaping, and they're encouraging it. I mean, all they focus on in Australia is the harm. And if you read the newspapers, vaping is deadly. You never hear anything about cigarettes. All you hear about is all the terrible harms of vaping. So it's no wonder that people feel that way.
Schmidt again. One question: in Germany, we have alcohol regulation that you can drink beer, wine, and champagne, so the softer alcohols, from 16 on, and only the harder stuff, the distilled alcohols, are restricted to 18 and older. And wouldn't it be sensible to limit the harmful cigarettes to 18 and older and allow vaping and other non-combustible products from 16 on?
Yeah, I think the idea of 21 as an age cut-off for cigarettes is very sensible, and 18 for vaping maybe, if you have to have an age. But the other point is related to that, of course, is that of all the risk-taking behaviours that kids indulge in, vaping is probably the least harmful one. I mean, you know, in 3 years ago, 91 teenagers in Australia died from alcohol. And of course, none have died from vaping. But, you know, vaping is the one that gets all the press, and that's the flavour of the month, so to speak. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Thanks. I just forgot to mention before, I think the other key reason why vaping is very attractive to kids is due to sleep disorders, because that's a really, really big problem, and, you know, certainly much more in this generation than previously when, you know, the access to IT, social media. So kids' sleep hygiene is just shocking, and they're really, really struggling. So, you know, again, it's not surprising that a bit of nicotine during the day perks them up. So again, you know, I'd like to really have more investment and understanding, amongst students about sleep.
Another one of the benefits they might be getting, yeah.
When it comes to researching kids, we are arrogant enough to try to predict all the responses. I think we need to have a more open dialogue with kids, because the kids of this generation are not stupid. As a matter of fact, I find them more engaging, prepared, intelligent than me at their age some time ago. And this is point number one. Maybe it's a comment. You can take it the way it is. The other point is we still have the duty of investigating absolute risk. Of course, I'm 100% in agreement with you, Colin, with what you've been saying. The reality is that in 20 years, there'll be no smoking in westernized world. So all this narrative about relative risk is okay for today, I understand. But I have many mothers, many people asking me, what about the health effects of these products? And of course, I cannot give an honest answer because nobody knows it. I agree, once again, that probably knowing the toxicology of these products, the the possibility of a risk is minimal. However, as a scientist, I still think that there are unknown unknowns associated with the product, and we have the obligation of start doing serious research on vapers who never smoked in their life and following them up years after years with the most sensitive endpoints that we can use. And you know, we have high-resolution CT scans applied to image analysis and machine learning. That's what we should be doing. I think we have this obligation. We need to build bridges with our opponents, talking about absolute risk and conceding that they are possibly right, but possibly wrong, as we are possibly wrong or possibly right.
No.
Okay?
No, I have a couple of comments to make on that. I don't agree that smoking will disappear in 20 years. I think it'll be around for a long time, at very low levels, I honestly think. Yeah. And what I say to people about absolute risk is you can smoke until you're 35 and stop and have a normal life expectancy after that. That's smoking. If you vape until you're 35, you could probably go for a lot longer than that without any serious long-term longevity reduction. So, yes, of course, we can't say there won't be any absolute risk, but there's a very good chance it will be highly less than what we experience from smoking. But you're right, of course, we don't know and we have to find out.
Yeah.
And we're missing that. And your study that went for 3.5 years was great. You couldn't make it go any longer?
It's not that I couldn't make it any longer. The problem was a very small sample.
Yeah, small sample, yeah.
And many of those people, they just went back to smoking, or you know, there are so many trajectories.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is you have to start with a large population and follow them up.
Yeah.
I mean, we learned from smoking, you know, if we should have started the longitudinal studies in the 50s, we should have known much earlier of the risk of smoking.
Yeah, so
it seems that we are not learning from mistakes.
I think that's a good segue into maybe moving into, in the last 10 minutes, the opportunity to open it up to any closing thoughts for our panelists and any closing questions from the floor. And please make sure that if you do have a question, you have a question, and phrase it as such. Would appreciate that. But with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists for any final remarks. All right, everyone said what they had. Chase, do you?
Can't stop him.
No, the different perspectives represented from machine learning and flavors and all of that is just incredible to hear. And I think as we keep kind of really figuring out what works as far as study design and making sure to have kind of a control group maybe for further studies or figuring out what technologies can really aid us in continuing to get here. This is exactly what these discussions are for. So I personally took a lot away from this. This is great.
I have a question for the audience. I wonder if I would think other people agree with me that this debate is driven by this concern about that small percentage of youth who are vaping, and I wondered if anybody's got any solutions to that. Someone suggested earlier, I think it was Konstantinos, that one option, no, it was, I know it was somebody else, the one option is to produce advertisements for children concerned about their parents who have died from smoking and how vaping could have saved their lives. So children losing their parents is a very powerful issue that affects children. When we forget about that side of it, that, you know, vaping, kids are exposed to their parents' secondhand smoke and their parents dying, and the economic issues about having a parent in the family who smokes. So that seemed like a good idea, but any other thoughts are very welcome, because it's really driving the debate, and it's really misleading and dominating the debate inappropriately, I think.
Just as a sort of a closing thought, I think, you know, what we've seen in Sweden compared to Australia, it's not It's not about prohibition. It's again, it's recognizing that everyone's journey is different. That some children will want to try it, but it won't become regular. We shouldn't be directing people to not smoke. We shouldn't be directing them to use any products. It's about giving people that choice and giving them the education that they need.
I'll add to that. I think people usually, they see a product that's more heavily regulated by the government and they say, okay, so it's more harmful. Like straight up, that these people know what they're saying, and the health doctors in the US, 81% or more of doctors think that nicotine causes cancer. And so people look at that and say, okay, so I don't need to look at the literature. I mean, the professionals are saying this. So it's very important to give people not only the choice, but the accurate information to make that choice in an informed manner.
I would make the point that somebody brought up earlier, I think it was Ricardo, that we're not giving kids accurate information. They're not stupid. The campaigns we see in Australia are outrageous. They're full of information about serious lung injury and gateway, and they're just absolutely outrageous. And kids are not going to believe this. I can't imagine that they're going to fall for it. They can get that information off the internet, and eventually they're going to lose trust in government, and I don't think these campaigns are going to work.
Now, Schmidt, on this topic, I would like to present an anecdote. In my youth, there was very much panic about all the drugs, and especially hashish. And actually, I wasn't very interested in that stuff until the media went crazy and promoted all the effects on the altered brain states and whatnot. So actually, it was this media frenzy that drove me to try it, and I have to say, I was really, really disappointed.
Wasn't as bad as they said.
All right, well, it looks like with that, we'll thank our panelists for their thoughts and a great discussion from everyone here. Thank you for your time, and we will close the science lab for GFN.